Hello, welcome to another Museum FAQ video conversation. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator of Paul Orselli Workshop here on Long Island. And lucky me to be joined today by Sonnet Takahisa. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Warm, but good.
Yeah, I know. It's we're fortunately we're not melting yet, but here we are. So, Sonnet, I always like to give the guests a chance to talk a little bit about their background because usually people who end up working in museums have interesting sort of trajectories here and there. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, and then we can open up today's conversation.
Thanks, Pop. Love being on this with the esteemed company you keep. So it's fun to have, and it's fun to have a conversation with you. I have been in the museum field now for some almost 45 years. Maybe it's more than that. Maybe longer if I count when I started in museums, which was in the museum gift shop at the Museum of Comparative Zoology when I was a student. And I was, I sold things in the gift shop in part because my parents, this was a nepotism thing. My parents had sold to the gift shop. They had an import wholesale business. So that's how I got into museums.
Our daughter needs a job. Why don't you hire her for the gift shop?
Yep, that's kind of how it worked. But from there, I majored in East Asian Studies. And as I was about to graduate and sort of think about what I wanted to do for a job, I decided I wasn't quite ready to go to graduate school because people who went to the Yenching Library looked kind of dusty. So I had sort of, I'm not sure where I had the chutzpah from, but I had created an independent study as an undergraduate and worked at the Peabody Museum directly with the director. And I worked in every single department at the Peabody Museum. I worked in collections. I saw the domestic beetles in the natural science. I crawled all over the attic to do an inventory of George Catlin portraits of Native Americans. It was amazing. But when the director of the museum called me in and said, I have the answer. And he pulled out they were then very popular, the replicas of Japanese food. You know how people made rubber versions of Oreos and ramen and things like that. He said, all of these people who want our visitors to touch stuff, we just give them these plastic replicas and that will solve the problem. And I knew there was something wrong about that. I knew there was something important to sort of giving people the opportunity to deal with something real. So I ended up going to the Boston Children's Museum, where they said to me, Sonnet, if you wait 6 months, instead of making $9 a week or something ridiculous, you can make 24 because we have an internship for, quote, minorities in the field, and you would be eligible. So for 6 months, I volunteered there, and I taught in a museum and school program for the Museum of Comparative Zoology. I went to schools, taught about Africa and native Northwest Coast Indians, both of which I knew nothing about, but went into classrooms and used the collections and worked with some fun educators. And I volunteered working in the collections at the Japanese House of the Boston Children's Museum. I had a degree in Japanese studies, and I had an interest in sort of doing something with Japan. I had an opportunity to write a grant, which allowed me to do what I never got to do as a child. I grew up in Brooklyn, and there were almost no other Asian Americans and very few Japanese Americans. And my dad didn't have an extended family. So when I got to the Children's Museum, it was a way to learn about being Japanese and Japanese culture. Fun fact, my birthday is the 3rd day of the 3rd month, which is Girls' Day in Japan. And it's a day when you put out for 2 weeks, you put out your collection of Japanese Girls' Day dolls. And the Children's Museum had several sets of these dolls. And we had a Japanese home. And I got to play the Japanese daughter. And that was the start of me sort of thinking about how to use collections in authentic ways to learn, to teach about other cultures, to bring people in. It also allowed me to write a grant proposal, to think about how festivals are ways that have certain traditions that people are eager to share and that other people are eager to learn from. So that was these 45, and then I got my minority. I think by then I got a grant and I didn't need the minority internship. I actually had a stipend through the grant. But went on to do more graduate work in East Asian Studies. By then I was ready to go to graduate school and landed a job with Bonnie Pittman at the Seattle Art Museum. Because she was good friends with Elaine Gurian, who had been one of my bosses at the Boston Children's Museum. So connections and mentors have always been important. And I think of Bonnie and Elaine as my museum moms, and they have taught me not just what I know about working in museums, but what it takes to be a museum worker, and what it takes to stand up for our field and for the people in our field. And they were incredible politicians, and I don't mean in the bad way, activists, maybe that's a better word. So I learned about being in an art museum, came back home to Brooklyn, worked at the Brooklyn Museum, where education was at a moment in time when there was funding for arts education. And when, because we were the Brooklyn Museum, we didn't have to compete with crowds. Somebody just said, you didn't have to, I don't like fighting those school groups. We were the school groups and we were part of the crowds. We were the crowd at the museum. And so as a team, we could be really experimental and sort of fly a little bit under the radar and do some really interesting things to think about what was important about working in museums. So did that. And then from there, I ended up working or founding the New York City Museum School, which at some point we can talk about or not. It's still going. It's a New York City public school. And we partnered, thanks to a lot of chutzpah, with amazing museums and amazing people, and really brought together the museum world and the school world. And then from there, 9/11 Memorial Museum, Newark Museum, a little bit of South Street Seaport thrown in there. I ended up finishing just last year with working at the Brooklyn Historical Society. And now I'm working independently as a consultant. I've been deinstitutionalized for real. And I am just happy to continue to have the opportunity to work in this in-between field that has been created around museums.
Wow. So your fingerprints are on museums from coast to coast. I wonder what the Japanese equivalent of chutzpah is.
Well, I am in between.
I know.
Chutzpah is my mother's side, and Japanese is my dad's side. So
that's awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. And you touched on a number of the things that I think our broader conversation will touch on today, because we're really interested, and I'm interested in having you expand on this notion of connection or connections or being a connector. And I think you touched on a couple of things which I think are really important. The notion of representation and what that really means in an institution, or what it can mean between the institution and the communities it serves. That sort of connection that moves beyond the museum or beyond the individual museum worker. So let's start there. Let's talk about connections, and let's talk about starting sort of inside the museum and the notion of representation, which of course continues to be an important topic in the field, and then broaden out a little bit towards the notion of museums really being, I'm going to say, creative partners or co-creators with their communities, and not everything sort of pointing out from the museum into the community, but more of a two-way diagram or conversation. So there, I've thrown the gates open wide. Where would you like to start related to
Well,
connections?
in a funny way, you know that book, I learned everything I learned in kindergarten.
Yeah.
I think in some ways, much of what I learned at the Boston Children's Museum. In so many ways, I learned about being a community activist. I learned about the importance of collections as a platform for telling stories and as a vehicle for making connections between people and things, between historical periods, between people and people. And I learned about the importance of connecting, if you will, across the generations. Not that I'm that, not that my mentors were that much older than me, but I do think that the connecting that happened at that place, not just between people and connections, but people and people, and the mentorships and the supportiveness that happens it doesn't happen in all institutions. And it also, I think, what was unique about the Children's Museum was the structure was really different. And I thought it was normal. I thought the things that were in place at the Children's Museum were what every place was like. And that was sort of a strange, rude awakening when I went out into the world. I thought that there was always a connection between objects and people, between the objects being useful, the things in the collections being useful, between the museum being a place where you gathered people so they could have experiences and learn from each other and learn with each other. I learned that there was not really a distinction between, I mean, I didn't learn it. It just was, there wasn't really a distinction between curators and educators and designers. Although I mean, or even between people who were doing Japanese home stuff and people who were doing grandmother's house, or grandfather's house, or whatever, or between the natural science or Giant's desktop. That there were so many interconnections in the world. And I also learned that there wasn't a hard and fast gateway between those who know and those who don't know. And I think I also learned that there wasn't, like, if you have chutzpah, and you have a wise mentor, you can go pretty far along in sort of taking an idea and finding ways to make it happen.
Well, it's interesting. There are these places and times where special things seem to happen, like things all come together. And like you say, when you're in the middle of it, or if you're starting out and that's the kind of place you're lucky to be in, and you're part of that whole thing, you think, oh, this, like you say, this is the way that it works everywhere. But clearly it's not. I mean, that I love this notion of, it's sort of, instead of an individual genius, it's like a scenius. It's like this place, this scene is a place where all these people come in and people are like, ooh, cool stuff's happening there. I want to work with them, the community and other museum workers and stuff. So clearly, Boston Children's Museum is a place that very influential in that regard to the museum business.
I was 21 and we got a grant to do Japanese traditional family festivals. So we decided to take over Faneuil Hall Marketplace. And in order to do that, I had to get the decorations from Japanese import companies. I had to learn Japanese dances from a the Buddhist church. I had to get the Asian American student clubs from the different universities, BU and Harvard and MIT, to help be the staff. I had to make sure that the Japanese moms who were part of the expat community living in the Route 128, you know, were making sure that what we were doing was right and authentic. And who knew at 21, 22 that this would be hard to do? You just did it. And then you had Elaine Gurian, you know, at the end of an event, giving you your notes and telling you how wonderful it is, but don't forget about this and make sure that you think about this. And so you were always learning and always moving on. When I went to the art museum in Seattle, I had one art history class under my belt. So that was different. But
Well, that was one more art history class than many of the visitors had.
True. Yes, exactly. And so what I got excited when I was confronted with the possibility of an exhibition, I knew that what was exciting about it would be at least authentic to some people, and that it was a way in. And that was exactly how I operated. You know, we did more with public programs than we did with school programs. You know, if we had a show of Islamic rugs, yeah, and they talked about how many knots per inch, I didn't know what that means until we had a weaver come in and show that. Or if someone is trying to explain Gertrude Stein and art of the early 20th century, we brought a dancer in to sort of talk about rolling over words and ideas and connecting it. So it was an art history lesson for me to be there. And at the same time, we had the white African collection that was new. We had a spectacular Asian American collection. We had a really strong modern and contemporary art collection. And part of my job was to make sure that people who care about those things also knew that the museum had collections in those areas, had collections that would be useful, inspirational, and could be used by these other folks to tell their own story.
So let's talk about nuts and bolts a little bit, because you know you have this wide range of experience. But let's say here we have people watching the video who might say, yeah, you know, I of course I want to engage with communities. I want the museum that I work at to be a more welcoming and expansive and accessible place. I mean, what do you, from your perspective, when you're thinking about those kinds of things, like how can I make my museum more welcoming and accessible? Like, what are the nuts and bolts that you think about? Who are the how do you engage with community partners in an authentic way, not a patronizing way or a tokenistic way?
So I'm remembering a not too long ago experience when I was in a museum with a large Latino and Hispanic community. This is before we had bilingual labels. And there was a very large social service organization in town that everyone had said, if you want to do anything, you got to work with them. So called them up, and the VP came over and brought her family workers with me. But she warned me in advance. She said, Sonnet, there's not much at your place for these folks. So you don't have anything in Spanish. You don't have anything, you know, that's going to talk to them. And I'm going to conflate now their experience with my close friend who brought his mother, who was a Puerto Rican lunch lady. You know, they came into the historic house and they spent half English, half Spanish, talking about one of the couches. Not because they had had necessarily that couch or because they read the label, but what it meant to have to think about cleaning that couch if you had that couch. You know, my friend's mom talked about using Q-tips to clean inside the inlaid pieces of wood, the carved wood, right? And the woman from this social service agency was amazed because these women said, A, we didn't know you had this. B, we didn't know that it would have provide a meaningful experience for us? And C, can we come back?
Yeah.
So, I think that's part of it. It's inviting, and it starts really small. It doesn't, bringing up, leading up to a festival is great, but festivals are one-offs. And festivals, happen, maybe they happen, if you're in an art museum, a festival happens every time you do an Indian exhibition, you call the Indian community. But in those days, what I remember from my earliest year was the amount of weight and responsibility that I felt. Forget about being represented, with inside, but to be authentic, to keep up the relationships. Being a multicultural coordinator, meant that when I left Seattle, I resigned from something like 11 boards
Oh boy.
because I was participating in so many different community groups and representing the museum. So, that's a both and. It's both saying what you need to do, and it's also sort of a call out to the institutions that, the Boston Museum, I didn't feel lonely there. I didn't feel like I was the only one, because everybody in that place was a crazy only one, whether you were a scientist who cared about, I don't know what Bernie Zabrowski cared about.
Everything.
Everything. That's what, everything, right? Or, so everybody sort of was an individual, and we came together. It was different in some other places, I have to say, but I think that sense of how do you make sure that, when you're outside representing, that your institution understands you don't just start something and then drop it and wait another 5 years.
Well, I think some of the words you just used are really important. I mean, there's a difference between feeling like you are a one off or a one time situation as opposed to an ongoing relationship between the communities that an institution serves and works with and is surrounded by. That I think is a big difference. Like if 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 you had said, sure, I'll be on your board, and it only showed up to one meeting, that wouldn't have gone over very well. It's like, well, who are these people? Like they say they want to work with us, and they don't even come to our meetings or that. I mean, I think that commitment and that sort of showing community partners that you're committed to an ongoing relationship. And I like that you went this way too, that it's a two-way thing, because too often, museums are like, oh, we'll send something out into the community, or the arrow is just pointing from the mothership into the
Or will take,
community. Yeah,
or
yeah.
will take.
That's right. We need some Indian dancers because we have an Indian art exhibit. Can you come to the museum? And that seems like a very negative transactional sort of relationship. So I'm really interested. We're opening up this idea of connections, and we talked about connecting between communities, and you talked about your personal connections and different ways that you've represented in that. I'm sort of interested in bringing the circle back around and talking about a different type of personal connection, and that is that sort of creative spark or inspirational spark. You mentioned the ladies coming and seeing that couch or that piece of furniture, and you're like, okay, that's the thing that connected with them. And there are so many opportunities, and certainly I would imagine many museum workers, got that museum bug, got that museum spark, something really stuck with them that they then were willing and able to work in museums. I'd just be interested to get your perspective about how, this is sort of like another nuts and bolts question. How can museums set up more opportunities to provide that creative spark, whether that's inspiration or some deep emotional connection? I think growing up in Detroit, every time I go to the Detroit Institute of Arts, and I've probably been to see the Diego Rivera court and the frescoes there, the murals, the Detroit Industry Series. I mean, I'm sure I've seen it dozens of times, multiple dozens of times. And it always has a big impact on me. And I think, people, there are things that really touch people and make a deep connection with people. I'd just be interested in your perspective, what museums can do to foster more of those kinds of sparks or connections to people as
So,
individuals, not like, oh, okay, we're trying to reach which are all important. We're trying to be more accessible to this community or that community, like now let's get down to the granular level. Like, how
I
can
was going
we
to say,
set that up?
I was going to say, I would start with something small, and starting. The favorite quote for me that I've always had in my every office is from Catcher in the Rye, when Holden Caulfield is talking about going to the Museum of Natural History. And the elephants are always there, they stay the same, but every time he comes, he's different, right? You had a different partner on the line, you stepped in a puddle with an oil slick, and he talks about the amount of connection that he has, not just one time, but over time. My father loved Shakespeare, hence my name. I can't tell you how many productions of Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet or King Lear I've seen, and each time, not only is the production different, but I'm different. And it's a different point in my life, and it's a different moment in my history, my personal history, so I see things differently. And so I think, instilling that kind of opportunity to have people have extended observation, looking at things for a long amount of time, to spend the time looking at the couch. I didn't stop them there. They just stopped there. And I didn't have a time limit on how long they could, stand there. And then they chatted as long as they wanted, right? So there's that, but then there's also bringing people back and seeing it again. So that's one thing. And that became an incredibly important tenet when we did the museum school, because that was what we really wanted people to understand, that it's those connections. And I'm going to, and this is a little heresy, but as an educator, I care about objects and I care about connecting people with the objects in museums. So for me, it is really sharing what we have, but it's also opening up the door to say what we have in terms of the resource information or the research or the interpretation and the label is only a little bit of some of the additional knowledge that these people from outside can bring. And again, Boston Children's Museum, we had collections. It was unusual for a children's museum to have collections, but how amazing it was to have them be the vehicle through which the conversations happen. These Japanese moms who were living in, suburban Boston, who didn't have access to these traditional kinds of artifacts and family personal heirlooms, right? Because those were back in Japan. So this was an opportunity for them to share it with their kids, to share it with other people, and to deposit information that they had and understand that it was valuable to the museum to take it on. All the way, fast forward 40 years later, as I worked at the Brooklyn Historical Society on this Muslims in Brooklyn project. Again, here was, a community whose stories have not been told or captured or been part of the official record. Here was this organization, it was already in progress, that had already put in place the importance of listening to these stories and been intentional about gathering a diverse number of stories. And then what became really interesting was to think about the different ways to make those stories shared and accessible to a broader public. Always part of the Historical Society's, now the Center for Brooklyn History, always part of their plan. But 2-hour oral histories, the long form of oral history, is a lot for an individual to listen to. Again, the brilliance of Deb Schwartz, a peer mentor, and an incredible friend who had this vision to say, let's think about different ways to make these oral histories accessible and this history accessible. So she commissioned an artist to work and do an installation that, you listened, it was like you were in a cafe, but you were walking in an immersive experience, seeing graphics, but hearing little snippets from the different oral histories. There was a historical timeline that explained and showed the breadth of occupation or people being in Brooklyn from the 1600s to now, and the diversity of those people, from Tatars to Nation of Islam, Southeast Asians to Africans. Amazing sort of sense of opening it up through this historical and geographic timeline. And then again, really prescient pre-pandemic, the sense of creating a website where these materials live forever. And again, the website originally was visioned as something for teachers that would be used for teachers. It was really clear it wasn't supposed to be to teach about Islam. It wasn't just meant for Eid or 9/11 when you need to learn about Muslim cultures. It was really a way to sort of show about Brooklyn history and who is here. So that made sense for teachers to expand it out. But the website itself ends up being incredibly valuable for the general public and accessible to the general public. And you have a sense of places in Brooklyn and events in Brooklyn that are sometimes hidden, even if you're a longtime Brooklyn resident, but certainly an information. So the ways that we use our collections in different kinds of platforms, both to first gather information and make sure that the information is accurate and true and realistic, but also then how people can use that information. And that's part of the connecting that I think we do.
Yeah, exactly. That brings us full circle. I mean, thinking about connections in that way. Also, I think what you said earlier makes me think of the value. So many museums and museum people talk about repeat visitors. We want repeat visitors, but why do you want repeat visitors? And I think, if you are fostering that ongoing connection with people, you are creating incentives for repeat visitors, but not in a sort of bogus transactional way. Like, oh, okay, that's like, it's instead of the museum model is sort of like professional wrestling. Oh, and this week we're gonna have the live alligator match. Come see that, and it's like, oh, we'll get repeat visitor, but it's really repeat one-time visitors. It's not that ongoing relationship that fosters repeat visitation. So I just think it's interesting that you touched on that. And collections.
Well, and I think it's also, I worry about us worrying about the numbers, the number of attendance, the number of clicks, that becomes the way that we measure success. Whereas, relationship building and creating true partnerships. I mean, I think that's what the connecting is about for me, building relationships and creating partnerships so that when you are presenting information, you are presenting with the people who it means something to, whether it's the artist or whether it's the visitor, to be able, and over the years in many different museums, first it was with an audio guide, and then it was, with different kinds of labels, but to have different voices allow that kind of inspirational provocation for you to think differently, for you to be mindful and intentional about your lifelong learning process and over time. When we created the museum school, the New York City Museum School, there was originally this sense of, yeah, we want to make all these young people museum goers. We were not trying to create museum professionals, although bonus, for the kids from museum school who are in the museum profession. So, and there are a couple, and it's really great. But the idea was really to sort of see museums as part of this lifelong learning ecosystem. And so that the connection was about another way of sort of ongoing engagement and participation is what you can learn from being in museums, and what you can learn about others, what you can learn about yourself, what you can learn about the person that you've gone to the museum with. Whether I learn from these women who can tell me the story of cleaning a couch, with Q-tips, all of that becomes part of thinking about the kinds of ways that museums contribute to a learning ecosystem.
Yeah, learning ecosystem. That's going to be the charge that I leave everyone, including ourselves, with today. How can we become better contributors to a broad-based learning ecosystem? I love that idea.
Well, but I think it's not simply by saying we're going to offer internships to high school students. That's okay. But it's really, and I think this was the genius that, for 10 years, I had the unbelievable, again, another dear mentor and peer and friend is my friend Ron Shalui-san, who is the co-director of the museum school. Ron and I came from different worlds. In fact, we tried to recruit him to be the director, and he was like, this woman doesn't know anything about schools. And now we're sort of thinking about what are the lessons learned from that experience. And the reality is there were certain things about museums that I instinctually knew were important. I wanted the kids to come to and the teachers to come to the museum. This wasn't about mini museums in the classroom. This was really about, and I know we've talked a little bit recently about decentering the museum building and all that kind of space, and I'm all for that. But there is something about the experience of coming into that museum space. There is something very different about what you are invited to do as a learner in a museum that, if we do it right, is very different and much more engaging than what happens in schools. If we do it right in museums, we are inviting you to be part of that co-construction of knowledge. We're inviting you to look, to contribute, to be realistic, to be thoughtful. We're giving a few prompts so you don't go off the rails, right? It wasn't made by an alien, or, like you need a few, and usually, but you need a few, sort of guardrails. But the reality is if we do it right, we allow the visitor to make meaning and make connections for themselves with the museum experience and what happens and what they see. And like those women, you find a way to find something that's meaningful and that connects for you, and that has a positive way. And if we do that right, then we've changed the way we think about learning. Then it's not just about pouring data and facts into you, but it's about how you stimulate curiosity, how you provide different kinds of tools for people to find more information and other information. Just went to the Brooklyn Museum, right? And you're looking usually in American paintings at portraits of colonial portraits of white women. Well, they've now thrown up a Faith Ringgold portrait in the midst of that, right? So you're juxtaposing and you're thinking about who and what, and the pose is really similar. The paint material is really similar, but there's a whole different sort of way that you're thinking about it and making meaning. And if we do it right, we're prompting people, we're jarring people. We talk about disrupting, but you're disrupting that kind of ecosystem. You're introducing something else. You're introducing a new idea, and you're introducing a new way of learning. we used to say to the museum school kids, how do we know about ancient Egypt? Right? Not because there's a textbook, right? How did the people who write the textbook figure out? They looked at an object, they looked at an object next to it, they looked at a similar object from somewhere else, right? They made and they co-constructed information. And if we're going to be part of the ecosystem, then we've got to let people, the learning ecosystem, then we've got to let people in on that process of making knowledge and making meaning. And that's more important to me than internships and having you be a docent. Lovely, and you get public speaking skills, but that sense of how we make meaning from what we have in our collections, and how it becomes meaningful to the people who experience it becomes what the connection is for me. And that's how we become part of the ecosystem. And then if you train people to sort of think and be observant, they can do it no matter where they go. They can do it with a text. They can do it with a piece of music. They can do it with a play. That it is about, you're part of the process to create knowledge.
All right. Well, Sonnet, I thank you very much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it. I'm going to be thinking more about learning ecosystems. I like even more about that, which is great. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for all your inspiration.
That's great. Thanks very much.